Hello and welcome to episode 67 and 68, Strategic Partnerships, Commercial Space Giants and the US Military. We have previously discussed on this podcast several aspects of military satellite, the way public-private partnerships and the government agencies interact, and the way emerging new space technologies are being integrated by the government, the kind of encouragement that happens from the government side for the private sector, but we haven't really taken a deep dive into the US market because I believe it took US almost 20 years to reach a point where a sustainability aspect is being playing very well, where the private sector is surviving very well on the government contracts, but this is not the case in any other part of the world. So I believe there is a lot to learn from the US market, the way US government, the private sector has reached this point and have been trying to basically encourage and give inspiration to the other parts of the world. So without any delay, to take a deep dive into this topic, I would like to introduce Shelli Brunswick. Hi, Shelli. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm so honored to be with you.
Thank you very much, Shelly. Likewise, thank you very much for your precious time. So, yeah, before we begin with the topic, I have seen your work, the kind of articles that you pen, the kind of quotes that you have on the platforms on the international level. So, would be glad if you can give a brief introduction about yourself, like what you have been doing previously, and then how did you end up in the space sector?
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to join you. And I always like to say my journey has 4 chapters. And my first chapter is I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force right out of high school. I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in college. I didn't have college money, and I wanted to see the world. And the Air Force was a great way to do that. And during that time, I got stationed in Turkey and Germany. I became a personnel specialist. So I did human resources, moving people around and ID cards and bonuses and training. But I was able to go to school at night, taking advantage of tuition assistance. And I completed both my bachelor's and master's degrees going to school at night. And this allowed me to apply to become an officer in the Air Force. And when I applied to become an officer in the Air Force, that started the second chapter of my journey. But the Air Force also made me a space acquisition officer, so a space procurement officer. And I know we're going to talk about space acquisitions in our interview later today. So that was a wonderful opportunity because that started my 25 years in the space industry, working on ground stations and launch vehicles and satellites, working as an in-plant rep for Northrop Grumman Space Park when I worked for Defense Contract Management Agency. I also was a professor at Defense Acquisition University teaching about the space acquisition life cycle and processes, and then culminated my career working on Capitol Hill as a budget and appropriation liaison, working with members of Capitol Hill to secure the budget and ensure the programs for not only space, but for all of the Air Force were maintained intact as was put forward by the president's budget. So it was an amazing journey, both being enlisted airman and an officer in the Air Force. And when I retired from the Air Force, my third chapter started when I went to work as the chief operating officer at Space Foundation. Space Foundation is a U.S. nonprofit that does business internationally. One of the things they're renowned for is their annual space symposium that brings the global space community together in Colorado Springs, averaging over 10,000 people, military, commercial, civil, and international. And what was so beneficial for my career growth was I had come out of military space with some interactions with NASA, but by going to work at Space Foundation, it really helped broaden my space portfolio to see that international, commercial, and civil piece a lot more fully. And over my 9 years at Space Foundation, we can really see how that commercial segment has taken off. So it was a wonderful opportunity at Space Foundation to lead a wonderful team. And Space Foundation is actually a nonprofit for education. So really looking at that capacity building. How does unlocking capacity around the world in emerging markets help create economic development, which then grows the space economy around the world? So it was a really great ecosystem to learn, understand, and be a leader in. And then most recently, I started the fourth chapter of my journey, which was launching my own company called SB Global LLC. And now my real goal is to be that advocate and bridge to the public sector about how space is benefiting us every day. Why is it important that we're part of a space economy, that we go back to the moon and onto Mars? And ultimately, how does this benefit us here on Earth? How does it benefit citizens here on Earth? So that's a quick overview of the 4 chapters of my journey and a little bit about my breadth and depth in the space industry.
Interesting. That's quite a vast journey, and I believe at the end of the podcast we'll be having one question which is related to the students. So yeah, I think we'll get to that point where you might be able to provide some more insights for the future leaders who would like to step in and would like to take a career path where you have transitioned from several verticals to the space industry. So yeah, we'll touch upon that part at the end of the podcast. But yeah, coming back to the point, we have seen that the US space market, especially, though I mean, I know recently there have been news that Planet has been laying off some people, but I still believe there are several companies, especially in the satellite communication segment, in the navigation side, even in the supply chain components, subsystem levels, where the market has been relatively healthy as compared to what we see in the other parts of the world because of the US government, their policies, the kind of agencies they have created over the years. So, from that perspective, can you explain the current landscape of the commercial space companies and their role in the US military's space strategy?
Well, absolutely. I think what we can see globally is the current landscape of commercial space companies is very dynamic and rapidly evolving. And it's playing an increasingly integral role in the US military space strategy, as well as the role for NASA. So, over the past decade, we have seen and witnessed significant shifts in the space sector with private companies emerging as key players alongside traditional government agencies such as NASA and the DoD. We're seeing SpaceX, we're seeing Blue Origin, Northrop Grumman, and others, how they're bringing innovation and agility and cost efficiency into the space ecosystem. In April of this year, we saw the Space Force release their commercial space strategy to increase competitive advantages. So we're seeing not only where NASA has brought in the commercial segment, but now we're seeing how the DoD is also creating policies to do that tech insertion from innovative companies. One of our big examples that all of us watches almost weekly now, we've just had another SpaceX launch, is launch services. How in 2004, how there was legislation that allowed for commercial launch providers to come into the market. And this opened the gateway for companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Rocket Lab to come into the segment. And what SpaceX and these other companies have done is dramatically lower the cost of launch, not only for the US government, but for NASA and for the commercial sector, which has created access to space, not only for the military, but for everyone on the planet, whether it's emerging space nations, it's academia, or it's companies wanting to put satellites into space. You're seeing how this evolving legislation and commercialization has not only benefited the military, but benefited the entire space ecosystem. So that's one area. The other area we can really look at is, when I was still in the military looking at space, we looked at what we called big juicy targets. And those were like big constellations, giant satellites that did everything. Maybe you only put up a few. And then now what we've seen is the environment in space has become more contested. And so we have ASAT testing taking place. So now what we're seeing is a different type of architecture for communication and defense satellites, where it could be distributed not only on military satellites, but also partnering with those companies. Most recently, you saw like SpaceX put up Starlink, and Starlink was used for the conflict taking place with Russia and Ukraine. So we're seeing where we don't necessarily need to use solely military assets in space to support strategic zones. We can also now use company assets, so that satellite technology and constellations we still need some of those unique military only hardened satellites, but we can also look at a distributed architecture, partnering with commercial to put that architecture on multiple commercial platforms. And then we're seeing the rise of what I like to call public-private partnerships. And my most recent Forbes article came out talking about how public-private partnerships are really wonderful for bringing the commercial space enterprise into the space ecosystem, partnering with NASA and the DoD. And you can see how it's working with some consortiums like the Space Enterprise Consortium and more. So those are just a few things that I see where commercial is now partnering more with the military sector.
Interesting. And I mean, that's quite a lot of information you have mentioned about the relationship, I would say, briefly. But to little bit take a deep dive on the private side as well. So, how has the relationship between the US government and private space companies evolved over the past few decades? Because we have seen the fact that before the Space Development Agency was created, I think it was created back in 2019 or 2020, somewhere between that. Before it was created, the things were not as streamlined as it is now. So, can you just give us an overview of how it has basically evolved and reached this point of success where every private company is now basically, surviving in a healthy manner, I would say, on the US government contracts?
Absolutely. Well, we can really look back, and we can look back to 60 years ago during the space race when, President Kennedy, charged NASA and the US to put a man safely on the moon and return him to Earth. And we can see that that was really government dominance. That was government led,
Yes.
government driven, a high amount of GDP, and it was successful. We did have an amazing Apollo program. What we've transitioned to after the government dominance was kind of a rise of commercialization in the 80s and 90s, where you could see the US government was encouraging the private sector to take over some of the things, that legislation and policies were being changed to allow for Commercial Space Launch Act, such as the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984, and other opportunities. So we really saw that rise of commercialization and lots of amazing space companies that came into being. Then what we saw was kind
Yes.
of a pivot in the 2000s, and I'm sure your audience is familiar with this one, which I'm going to call the rise of space entrepreneurs,
Yes.
SpaceX, Blue Origin, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. And again, that was brought on again by legislation in 2004 for that commercial crew, incentivizing and creating the policies and framework that allowed that. And now what I say again is we're seeing again that pivot into we still have entrepreneurs, but now we're seeing a lot of public-private partnerships. We certainly did public-private partnerships for SpaceX and Commercial Crew and Boeing, and we're seeing public-private partnerships for the replacement of the International Space Station. The International Space Station is due to be retired in 2030, so there are multiple contracts that have been put out, and there are other policy or funding mechanisms that allow this public-private partnership, whether it's DARPA, whether it's NASA, whether it's DoD, that are allowing this rise of public-private partnerships.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, and just to take a step ahead, I would say, primarily from the innovation perspective. So, what are some of the most significant technological innovations from commercial space companies that the military is utilizing?
Well, absolutely. I think the first one that we all acknowledge and accept is SpaceX. And
Yes.
I was there working as a legislative liaison, taking staffers from Capitol Hill to tour SpaceX's facility in Hawthorne, California, when it was nothing but a big warehouse, and how they've converted that into creating rockets and an amazing manufacturing of the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavies. And then, since then they've pivoted and now they have operations in Texas as well. And even more, they've refurbished launch facilities at Cape Canaveral. So you're really seeing that reusable launch vehicle and how that has made launch a service. So before, you think about it, the government ran launch and you built a rocket to fit your payload, your satellite. Now we the government, and I'm not the government anymore, so maybe I shouldn't say it that way. I should say the government is now looking to buy launch as a service, just like any other service.
Yes.
And it will meet SpaceX or Blue Origin or Rocket Lab will say, this is the size of rocket we have. Your payload has to fit this size. And you purchase that launch and you put your payload, your satellite on that launch. So now we're seeing launch as a service. The other
Yes.
thing we're seeing a big change in is also that small satellite constellation I mentioned earlier. Um, we still need military hardened satellites for certain activities, military secure communications, in the battlefield, the area of operation, or Earth observation data. But we can also see where that type of military only satellite can be complemented by small satellite constellations, such as Starlink or OneWeb's communication. You could also see it with satellite imaging. I mentioned
Yes.
how they're using Starlink, in Ukraine, but you can also see how satellite imaging, we saw the buildup of Russian tanks and soldiers and the buildup before the invasion happened in Ukraine. So we can use satellite imaging, whether it's military only or whether it's from Maxar Technologies or Planet Labs that are providing that Earth observation data. And that Earth observation data is not only telling us, about those activities, but before you can do any missions as a military individual, before you do any missions, you also want to look at weather conditions, right? Before you put ships or people in harm's way, what is the weather going to be? So again, that Earth observation data of what is happening with the weather, are these good opportunities to do military operations? We also see not only Earth observation and weather on Earth, but also solar, the sun's weather patterns and how the solar winds can impact our satellites and their infrastructure because of things that happen. And then another big area I'm going to highlight is our space situational awareness.
Yes.
Space has become very congested. I'm sure, people are probably saying space is congested. It's like space is infinite. Yes, space is wonderful, but the orbits around our planet, low Earth orbit, there is a lot of items that are going up. Like I said, all these massive constellations, and we have orbital debris. So we really need a system for monitoring and tracking space situational awareness. And then we also need a system that can do in-orbit servicing so we can reuse those satellites we have. Can we refuel them and reuse them so we don't have to keep replacing them and adding more debris? And how do we remove that debris from orbit so that we can continue to put satellites into Earth orbit, in that low Earth orbit, that are operational and don't become just space debris? So those are just a couple of the areas that I'll highlight that are really areas where commercial space innovation can collaborate and partner with military operations.
Interesting. Yeah, I believe you mentioned several of the points, but I think the space debris, of course, is very important. And I believe from the private uh, industry's innovation perspective, you mentioned about the SpaceX, and I would like to highlight this fact that launch was and still is a very risky business. Not everyone has cracked the code for that. Of course, even I mean, the Rocket Lab has been trying, but I believe uh, India's Indian Research and Space Organization and SpaceX, these are the only organizations who have more than 90% of the success rate at the moment. But I don't think so. Even China doesn't have that much of a success rate. But yeah, of course, with SpaceX is the reusable launch vehicle that they have. And I think we really need more and more innovation on the launch side, because I think a demand is a lot, but on the supply side, supply is also there. It's not only Rocket Lab. There are several companies like Dawn Aerospace. Then there was Astra as well. But I believe the success rate has been pretty low in terms of these new companies. So I hope that changes in the future. What are your general thoughts on this?
Well, absolutely. I don't want to be cliche, but people say it all the time. Space is hard. It is
Yes.
rocket science. And so it
Yes.
is challenging. And not only is it those activities, but when you add the humans into the equation, we're going to return to the moon. We're going to take the first woman and person of color to land on the moon. We're then going to go on to Mars. You're entering humans into that equation. And so that makes it even more risky when we're looking at launch vehicles, space stations, lunar research centers. And the other part we haven't talked on is, for the most part, our rocket technology is the same. We really need to start looking at advanced propulsion systems. How are we going to do things smarter, more efficiently? And as we look at becoming an interplanetary species, what is that? we can't use the fuel we're currently using. So what is that? Is that nuclear? So there's a lot of opportunity in advanced propulsion systems. And I know
Yes.
we're talking about military, and I'm kind of talking about civil a little bit, but ultimately, as we become an interplanetary species, that is the role of the military, to protect
Yes.
those shipping lanes, to allow free commerce. That is the role of the Navy on the planet, on Earth, is to ensure that commerce flows freely, that companies can work, that goods move and transition around the planet in a safe and
Yes.
secure manner. Now, we do know there's some conflict taking place in the Red Sea, where the Navy has deployed in other countries to try to keep those shipping lanes open because of challenges. But we've had challenges on Earth for forever. Pirates. We think about the Barbary Coast, and when the U.S. was first founded over 200 years ago, and President Jefferson deploying a navy to protect U.S. assets. So you're just seeing Space Force extend that protection of the shipping lanes into space as we look at becoming an interplanetary species. So I think it's really important that we haven't talked about it yet, but it's not only the propulsion systems and the technology, but the legislation and the space law policies need to keep up with where we are going as humanity. And it can't just be the US doing it alone. It has to be all international players. So I'll kind of pause there, and I know we have a
Yes.
further question.
Yes.